You said yes. Your mouth moved before your mind had finished forming the sentence, and you heard the word land in the room like something knocked off a shelf, already broken before it hit the floor. Your shoulders dropped an inch. They always do, right after you hand over another piece of the day that was supposed to belong to you. This wasn't the first time. It won't be the last. Somewhere between the calendar invite you didn't want to accept and the favor you didn't have room for, you've built a life out of agreements you never actually made with yourself. Ask yourself, honestly, when you last spent an entire day without editing what you wanted to say before you said it. Not last week, not last month. You already know the answer, and it's the reason your jaw tightens when someone asks if everything's okay. What you're about to hear isn't a plan for becoming someone new. It's an excavation of someone who's been buried under 2 decades of politeness, strategy, and borrowed opinions. Still breathing, still waiting. The work isn't addition, it's removal. You've spent your whole life believing that fitting in was the safe choice, the smart one, the one that kept you loved. What if the opposite has always been true? What if the real danger was never standing apart from the crowd? What if it was disappearing into it so completely that no one, including you, could tell where the crowd ended and you began? Based on the book Self-Reliance by Ralph Waldo Emerson, and adapted into narrative format to make its ideas practical and engaging. Chapter 1. The Borrowed Life. The disorder never announces itself. It arrives disguised as good manners. You notice it first in small rooms, a conference table, a kitchen with relatives you love but rarely agree with, a group chat where an opinion is forming, and you can feel your own opinion, the real one, quietly stepping back to let the louder one pass. Nobody forces you to do this. Nobody has to. You've been doing it so long that it no longer feels like a decision. It feels like temperament. It feels like who you are. Here's what almost no one tells you. The first sign of losing yourself isn't dramatic. It doesn't look like a crisis. It looks like agreement. It looks like nodding along in a meeting about a project you have real reservations about, because raising those reservations would take more energy than you have left, or more courage than you're willing to spend before lunch. It looks like telling your partner the restaurant is fine. When it isn't fine, it's the third choice you've settled for this month. Each of these moments taken alone is nothing, a rounding error. The problem isn't any single yes. The problem is what all of them add up to when nobody's counting except the part of you that keeps score in silence. Think about the last time you changed your answer mid-sentence because you read the room, and the room wanted something different than what you were about to say. You felt the shift happen in your own body before your mind caught up to it, a kind of internal flinch, quick and practiced. That flinch has a name, though you've probably never called it anything. It's the sound of your own judgment stepping aside for someone else's comfort. And the terrifying part isn't that it happens. The terrifying part is how smooth it's become. You don't even feel the gears shift anymore. There's a difference between adapting to people and dissolving into them, and most of us stopped being able to tell the two apart somewhere around adolescence, when the cost of disagreement first outweighed, in our still-forming minds, the cost of disappearing a little. Adapting means you bend without losing your shape. Dissolving means there was never a shape firm enough to hold. The tragedy of most adult lives isn't that people are cowards, it's that they were never taught the difference, so they call their dissolving flexibility, and they call their disappearing kindness, and they build entire identities on words that were never quite true. You can trace this pattern back further than you'd like to. Somewhere, a long time ago, you learned that your unfiltered reactions, the ones that came before you'd had time to sand them down for public use, made someone uncomfortable. Maybe a parent, maybe a teacher, maybe a room full of classmates whose laughter you still remember more clearly than you remember most of that entire year. And so you did what any intelligent, adaptable creature does when a behavior produces pain. You stopped doing it. You built a second self, a curated one, sanded smooth enough to pass safely through rooms that punished sharp edges. That second self got so much practice, so much daily rehearsal that eventually it stopped feeling like a costume and started feeling like skin. Here's the distinction that matters, the one most people never draw because drawing it requires admitting something uncomfortable about their own history. There's a version of you that reacts, and there's a version of you that performs a reaction it thinks will be better received. The first version is unreliable in small ways, and honest in every way that counts. The second version is polished, agreeable, and almost entirely borrowed. Ask yourself which one showed up the last time someone asked what you thought of their plan, their poem, their choice of partner. If you're being honest, and this chapter has no interest in letting you be anything less, you already know which one answered. You might be tempted to think this doesn't apply to you, that you're simply easygoing, low maintenance, someone who picks their battles. Sometimes that's true. Often it's a story you tell yourself to avoid noticing how few battles you've picked in the last 5 years. There's a version of easygoing that comes from genuine equanimity, a settled sense that most things don't need your resistance. And there's a version that comes from exhaustion, from a long habit of surrender so old it stopped registering as surrender at all. The two look identical from the outside. They feel nothing alike from the inside, if you're still willing to check. What makes this pattern so difficult to catch is that it never costs you anything all at once. You don't lose yourself in a single afternoon. You lose yourself one comfortable, forgivable, perfectly reasonable accommodation at a time, and each one comes with a built-in alibi. You were being considerate. You were choosing your battles. You were being the bigger person. All of that might even be true in isolation, but add up enough true, small, forgivable moments, and you get an entire decade lived at half your actual volume, and nobody handed you a receipt. There's a particular kind of tiredness that has nothing to do with sleep, and if you've felt it, you already know exactly what it is. It's the tiredness of performing coherence you don't feel. It's the exhaustion of being reasonable about things that, if you were honest, you have real and unreasonable feelings about. It doesn't show up as a breakdown. It shows up as a low hum underneath an otherwise functional life, the sense that you're fluent in everyone's expectations except your own, that you could recite, without hesitation, what your boss wants, what your mother wants, what your partner wants, and go completely blank if someone asked what you actually want, right now, today, without qualification. This is the first sign, and it's worth naming plainly before anything else can happen. You have grown so skilled at reading the room that you've lost some of your fluency in reading yourself. Not all of it, not yet, but enough that the question, "What do I think?" now takes a beat longer to answer than it used to, a small hesitation, a flicker where you check the room before you check your own reaction. That flicker is not a character flaw, it's a habit, built the same way every habit is built, through repetition and reward. And habits, unlike character, can be examined without shame. That's the only kind of looking this work will ever ask of you. Not judgment, just a clear, unflinching look at the gears that have been quietly running your life, so that you can finally see them well enough to choose which ones keep turning. That coffee is cold now. The cup is still on the table. And the only question that actually matters, the one you can't answer with words alone, is whether you're going to sit back down. There's a quieter cost worth naming before this chapter lets you go. And it concerns a specific kind of vigilance you've likely stopped noticing entirely. Reading a room accurately requires constant low-grade attention, a background process running underneath every conversation, calculating temperature, calculating risk, calculating the safest available response before your original one has even finished forming. That process is exhausting in ways that rarely announce themselves as exhaustion. It simply drains a portion of your attention that could have gone toward actually being present in the room, actually listening, actually connecting with the people in front of you instead of managing their perception of you. You've likely mistaken this drain for social fatigue, for introversion, for simply needing more rest than other people seem to need. Sometimes that's true. Often what's actually happening is that a significant portion of your energy in any given room is being spent on a task nobody asked you to perform. Running calculations in service of a self-protection system built for rooms you left a long time ago. Chapter 2. The Functional Denial. You've built a very convincing case for why now isn't the time. Not never, just not now. Not while the mortgage is what it is, not while the kids need this particular version of stability, not while the job market looks the way it looks this quarter. The case is airtight. It's also been airtight for years, updated seasonally with new evidence, filed and refiled under different headings, always arriving at the same conclusion. Later. Not because you're weak, because you're responsible. There's a particular kind of intelligence that gets weaponized against the self, and it's worth naming because you almost certainly possess it. You're smart enough to construct a reasonable argument for nearly anything, including the argument that avoiding a hard truth is actually wisdom. Denial, in most people's imagination, looks like stupidity, a refusal to see what's obviously there. That's not how it operates in anyone above room temperature intelligence. Functional denial looks like sophistication. It looks like nuance. It looks like someone who has clearly thought this through, has weighed the risks, has arrived at a measured decision to wait. The tragedy is that the waiting rarely ends. It just gets a new set of justifications every few months, each one perfectly reasonable. None of them ever quite reasonable enough to produce action. Here's a distinction worth sitting with, because most people confuse the two their entire lives. There's ignorance, which is not knowing something, and there's functional denial, which is knowing something and building an elaborate architecture around it so you never have to feel the weight of knowing. Ignorance is innocent. Functional denial takes work. It requires constant maintenance, a kind of low-grade vigilance that spends real energy keeping a true thing just outside the frame of your attention. You've felt this vigilance before, even if you never called it that. It's the reason certain conversations exhaust you disproportionately to their length. You're not tired from talking. You're tired from managing what you refuse to look at directly, while the conversation keeps circling near it. Consider the shape this takes in an ordinary week. Someone asks how work is going, and you give the answer you've given for 2 years. The one about how it's not perfect, but it's stable. And you deliver it fluently, without hesitation. Because you've said it so many times it no longer requires thought. That fluency should concern you more than it does. A true feeling, freshly examined, usually comes out a little rough around the edges. It stumbles, revises itself mid-sentence, admits complexity. An answer that comes out smooth every single time isn't insight. It's a script, and scripts exist precisely so you don't have to generate a new, possibly uncomfortable answer each time the question comes up. The specific genius of functional denial is that it doesn't ask you to lie. It asks you to reframe, which feels virtuous, almost like emotional maturity. You're not avoiding the fact that the relationship has gone quiet in all the ways that used to matter. You're being patient. You're not avoiding the fact that you stopped believing in the direction of your own career 2 promotions ago. You're playing the long game. Every act of avoidance gets dressed in the language of a virtue, and the dressing is so convincing that even you, the one doing the dressing, start to believe the costume is the truth. Ask yourself honestly what you would need to admit if you stopped reframing for exactly 1 day. Not to anyone else, just to yourself. In the 15 seconds before sleep, when the noise of the day finally drops away and something quieter tries to speak. Most people never give that 15 seconds a fair hearing. They reach for the phone or the next thought, or the familiar loop of tomorrow's tasks, precisely because that 15 seconds is where the managed feeling starts to leak past its containment. You've felt it happen. the flicker of something true trying to surface right as you're drifting off, and the almost automatic reflex to grab something, anything, that pulls you back into distraction before the feeling finishes forming. There's a reason this matters more than it might seem to on the surface. A society, a family, a friendship. All of it runs more smoothly when its members agree not to look too closely at certain things, and there is enormous, constant, largely invisible pressure rewarding you for maintaining that agreement. Nobody claps when you finally admit the truth you've been avoiding. Often, the opposite happens. The people around you have organized their own comfort around your continued denial, and when you stop performing it, you disrupt something they were quietly relying on. This is worth sitting with, because it explains something that otherwise looks irrational. Why the people closest to you sometimes resist your growth, even when they claim to want it for you. Your denial wasn't only serving you, it was load-bearing for an entire structure of relationships built around the version of you that doesn't ask hard questions. None of this means the truth you're avoiding is catastrophic. Sometimes it's smaller and stranger than that, closer to a preference you've suppressed so long you've forgotten it was ever yours. Maybe it's simply the recognition that you don't actually enjoy the life you've built to look impressive from the outside. That admission doesn't require you to burn anything down. It only requires you to stop calling the fire an accident. What functional denial actually protects isn't comfort. It protects a story about who you are, one you've been telling long enough that it feels less like a story and more like a fact of nature. Unwinding it doesn't happen through a single confrontation, a single hard conversation, a single dramatic reckoning in the middle of the night. It happens the way it was built, one small refusal to look away at a time, until the muscle you spent years training to avert its gaze slowly, unevenly, learns to hold steady instead. You already know which truth this chapter is circling. You knew it before the first sentence finished. The only remaining question is how much longer you're willing to keep calling your avoidance of it patience. There's a final piece of this worth naming before moving on, because it explains why functional denial is so much harder to release than to identify. The thing being avoided isn't actually the frightening part. Most people, once they finally look directly at the truth they'd been circling, discover it's smaller and more manageable than the years of avoidance had made it feel. What's frightening is the identity reorganization that follows admission. The fact that once you stop calling the fire an accident, you also have to stop being the person who lives comfortably next to accidental fires. That reorganization, not the truth itself, is usually the real source of the resistance, and naming it accurately is often enough to shrink it down to a size you can actually work with, instead of a shapeless dread you keep managing indefinitely. Shrink it down, look directly at it, and notice how much smaller it is than the years you spent avoiding it ever led on. Chapter 3. The Named Pattern. There's a word for what you've been living, and until now, you haven't had it. Emerson had a word for it. He called it conformity, but that word has grown so tame with overuse that it barely registers anymore, filed away with diet advice and productivity tips, something you nod at and forget by lunch. The pattern this chapter names deserves a sharper word, because the thing itself is sharper than conformity suggests. Call it the outsourcing of judgment. Every time you check the room before you check yourself, every time your answer waits for a cue before it forms, you're handing a small piece of your own authority to whoever happens to be watching. Do this enough times across enough years, and you wake up one day the co-owner of a life you never fully authored. Here's the mechanism, laid out plainly, without the softening you've probably applied to it until now. You possess an original instinct about nearly everything, a first, unfiltered reaction that arrives before social calculation has time to intervene. That instinct is yours. Nobody gave it to you, and nobody can take it, not directly. What they can do, and what you have let them do for years, is make the cost of expressing that instinct high enough that you learn to substitute it almost instantly with a second reaction built for public consumption. The tragedy isn't that you have a public-facing self. Everyone does. And there's nothing wrong with tact. The tragedy is when the substitution happens so fast, so early in the process, that you stop being able to locate the original instinct at all. You reach for it and find only the version that was already built for approval. Distinguish this carefully from cooperation, because the two get confused constantly, and the confusion is where most people lose themselves without ever noticing the exit. Cooperation is choosing, with your judgment intact, to align with someone else's plan because you've weighed it and found it sound, or because the relationship matters more than the particular disagreement. Conformity, the kind this chapter is naming, skips the weighing entirely. It doesn't ask whether the room is right. It only asks whether disagreeing with the room is safe. Those are entirely different operations, run by entirely different parts of you, and only one of them deserves to be called a decision. You've watched this pattern operate in people you respect, which is part of what makes it so hard to see in yourself. Competent people, accomplished people, people who would never describe themselves as pushovers, still perform this quiet substitution dozens of times a week, in rooms where the stakes are almost embarrassingly small. A restaurant choice, a scheduling preference, an opinion about a film that everyone else in the group has already agreed was brilliant. And you, sensing the current, adjust your praise to match it before you've even finished deciding what you actually thought. None of these moments will ruin your life individually. Their accumulation is the thing worth naming, because accumulation is precisely what turns a habit into an identity. Consider the specific discomfort of being the only person in a room who disagrees, and notice how disproportionate that discomfort usually is to the actual danger involved. Nobody is going to exile you from your family for preferring a different restaurant. Nobody is going to fire you for holding a minority opinion about a film. And yet, the body responds as though something ancient and serious is at stake. Heart rate ticking up, a tightness behind the sternum, an urge to soften your position before you've even stated it fully. That physiological response evolved for a reason. For most of human history, being cast out of the group was a genuine threat to survival, not a metaphor. Your nervous system hasn't caught up to the fact that disagreeing about a restaurant is no longer a matter of life and death. And until you name that gap explicitly, it will keep making decisions for you that your conscious mind never agreed to. This is worth stating without euphemism, because euphemism is exactly what has let the pattern survive this long undetected. What you've been calling flexibility is, more often than you'd like to admit, fear wearing a more presentable outfit, fear of the raised eyebrow, fear of the slightly longer pause before someone responds, fear of being the name that comes up later, in a conversation you weren't invited to, as the person who made things a little difficult. That fear isn't irrational. It's simply outdated, calibrated to stakes that no longer apply to most of the rooms you walk into. There's a further layer to this, one that explains why naming the pattern feels less like relief and more like grief when it finally happens. If you've been substituting your original instinct for a socially calibrated one for long enough, you may have lost track of how to locate the original instinct on demand. Ask yourself, right now, what you actually think about a decision currently pending in your life. Something real, something with consequences. Notice how many seconds pass before an answer arrives, and notice whether that answer sounds like it came from you or from an average of everyone whose opinion you've absorbed on the subject. For many people, that gap, the delay between the question and a genuinely original answer, has grown long enough to be its own kind of evidence. None of this is offered as an indictment. The pattern was adaptive once. It kept you liked, kept you employed, kept you inside relationships that mattered to you. And there is no shame in having built a survival strategy that worked for the situations you were actually in. The problem isn't that the strategy existed. The problem is that strategies, once they succeed enough times, stop being reconsidered. They calcify into identity, and identity defends itself against revision far more fiercely than any temporary tactic ever would. You now have a name for what's been happening, and a name changes something, even before any action follows it. It's much harder to keep doing a thing once you can say its name out loud to yourself in the quiet moment before sleep. The pattern doesn't dissolve the instant it's named. It simply loses the cover of invisibility it had been operating under, and things that lose their cover eventually have to answer for themselves. What you do with that answer is not yet the subject of this chapter. For now it's enough to sit with the recognition itself, uncomfortable as it is, and resist the urge to immediately reach for a solution. Solutions arrive later, and they arrive better when they're built on an honest accounting rather than a rushed one. Right now, the only task is to let the name sit where the confusion used to be, and to notice how much of your life reorganizes itself around a thing, once it finally has a shape. There's a final observation worth making before this chapter closes, one that connects the name back to something practical, rather than leaving it purely conceptual. Once you can name the outsourcing of judgment while it's happening, rather than only in retrospect, you gain something previous versions of yourself never had access to, a choice point that used to pass by too quickly to notice. That choice point doesn't guarantee you'll choose differently, not yet. That work belongs to later chapters. What it guarantees is that the choice will, from this point forward, actually register as a choice, rather than disappearing into the seamless automatic substitution that's been running your responses for years without your consent. Chapter 4. The Anatomy of the Mechanism. Now that the pattern has a name, it deserves a closer look. Not judgment, understanding. Every mechanism, once you take it apart, turns out to be simpler than the mystery surrounding it suggested. The substitution you've been performing for years, the swap of your original instinct for a socially calibrated one, runs on 3 moving parts, and once you see them clearly, you stop mistaking the whole operation for some fixed feature of your character. It was never character. It was a sequence, and sequences can be interrupted. The first part is detection. Before you're consciously aware of it, some older, faster region of your mind has already scanned the room and registered its temperature. Who holds status here? What response would land well? What response would land badly? This happens in a fraction of a second, well before your original instinct has even finished forming. You've felt the speed of this before. In the moment someone asks your opinion and you notice, if you're paying close attention, that a kind of pre-answer has already arrived before your actual answer has. That pre-answer isn't a lie, it's a forecast, and forecasted, however accurate, are not the same thing as truth. The second part is substitution, and this is where most of the damage happens, quietly, without your conscious permission. Once the forecast comes back unfavorable, your mind doesn't discard your original instinct outright. It buries it beneath a more palatable version, one engineered on the spot to satisfy the room's forecasted temperature. This happens so quickly that most people experience the substituted answer as their real one. They're not lying when they say it. They genuinely believe in that moment that the polished answer is what they think. This is precisely why the pattern is so difficult to catch by introspection alone. You can't outthink a process that completes before your thinking begins. The third part is reinforcement, and it's the part that turns a single substitution into a permanent architecture. Every time the substituted answer succeeds, every time it earns approval, avoids conflict, keeps the room comfortable, your mind logs that success as evidence the substitution was correct. Do this a few thousand times over a couple of decades, and the substitution stops needing conscious triggering. It becomes the default setting, running in the background of nearly every exchange you have, and your original instinct gets relegated to something closer to a rumor about yourself, distant and rarely consulted. Here's a distinction worth holding on to. because collapsing it is exactly what keeps people stuck. There's a difference between tact and erasure. Tact takes your original instinct and finds a considerate way to express it. Erasure replaces your original instinct before it ever gets expressed at all. The first preserves you while adjusting your delivery. The second removes you from the exchange entirely, leaving behind only a version of you optimized for the comfort of whoever's listening. Most people believe they're practicing tact for years after they've actually crossed over into erasure, and the two feel similar enough from the inside that the crossing goes unnoticed. Consider what this looks like inside an ordinary disagreement with someone you love. Your first instinct arrives, sharp, maybe a little unfair in its initial phrasing, the way honest first instincts often are before they've had time to round their own edges. If you're operating in tact, you take that instinct and translate it into something clear but kind, something that still carries the truth of what you felt. If you're operating in erasure, you skip the translation step and go straight to whatever keeps the peace, and the version that emerges bears so little resemblance to your original instinct that even you might forget, an hour later, what you'd actually felt in the first place. The peace you keep in that second case is real. So is the cost. You just don't see the invoice until much later, when you notice you can no longer name what you want in a relationship you've spent years accommodating. There's a bodily component to all of this that deserves attention, because the mechanism doesn't only run in your thoughts. It runs in your shoulders, your jaw, the place behind your sternum where tension gathers before you've consciously registered feeling anything. Notice the next time you catch yourself mid-substitution, what your body is doing. A held breath, a subtle bracing, as if preparing for impact that never quite arrives, because you diverted around it in time. That bracing is information. It's the physical signature of a true response being intercepted before it reaches the surface. And learning to notice it is the first practical tool this narrative will offer you, though not yet the tool for changing it. It's worth being honest about something uncomfortable here. This mechanism is not a design flaw. It's a design feature, built by evolution to keep social creatures inside groups whose survival depended on cohesion. For most of human history, the person who reliably said the difficult true thing at the wrong moment paid a real price, sometimes a fatal one. Your mechanism isn't broken. It's doing exactly what it was built to do, with a precision that would be admirable if it weren't costing you access to your own mind. Understanding this removes something important from the equation: the shame that usually accompanies this recognition. You are not weak for having this mechanism. You are human. The only real question is whether you'll keep letting it run unexamined, or whether you'll finally look at its gears closely enough to know when to let it operate and when to override it. None of this yet answers what an override looks like in practice. That's not this chapter's job. This chapter's job was only to take the machine apart in front of you, piece by piece, until the mystery of "why do I keep doing this?" resolves into something far less mysterious. A detection system, a substitution routine, and a reinforcement loop, running exactly as designed, waiting for you to notice it's not the only system available to you. You've spent years assuming this was simply who you are. It was never who you are. It was only what you'd trained, and what's trained can be retrained once you finally see the wiring instead of just the results it produces. There's one more piece of this anatomy worth naming, because it's the piece that makes the mechanism feel so total, so difficult to catch anywhere else in the process. All three parts, detection, substitution, reinforcement, run faster than the portion of your mind responsible for narrating your own experience back to you. By the time your inner narrator has anything to say about a given exchange, the exchange has already happened, already been logged, already reinforced whichever pattern completed it. This is why insight alone, arrived at afterward in a moment of quiet reflection, rarely changes anything on its own. Insight operates on the narrator's timeline. The mechanism operates faster than that, closing the gap between them teaching the noticing to happen inside the moment rather than after it, is the actual task the next several chapters exist to build. That's the task ahead, and it starts in the very next chapter. Chapter 5. The Hidden Cost. Nobody sends you a bill for the years you spent agreeing with people you privately disagreed with. The cost arrives anyway. It just arrives late and unmarked, and disguised as something else entirely. Start with the most obvious cost, the one you can almost quantify if you're willing to sit with the math. Every time you substituted your original instinct for a socially calibrated one, you spent a small amount of a finite resource, the trust you place in your own perception. That resource doesn't replenish automatically. It rebuilds the way muscle rebuilds, through use, through small repeated tests where your judgment gets exercised and confirmed. Spend years avoiding that exercise, and the muscle doesn't stay neutral. It atrophies. This is why so many capable, intelligent people report feeling paralyzed by decisions that shouldn't be difficult. A restaurant, a career move, a simple yes or no to an invitation. It isn't indecision in the way most people mean the word. It's a muscle that hasn't been asked to do real work in years, suddenly asked to lift something heavy. There's a second cost, quieter and harder to name, and it concerns the people who love you. You might assume that a lifetime of accommodation makes you easier to love. In the short term, it often does. People generally prefer the agreeable version of you to the version that pushes back. But consider what you're actually offering them in that exchange. A relationship built on your consistent self-erasure isn't a relationship with you at all. It's a relationship with a curated ambassador you've sent in your place, competent, pleasant, reliable, and fundamentally unknowable. Because the real positions, the real reactions, the real disagreements never make it to the surface where anyone could actually encounter them. People closest to you may sense this without being able to articulate it. A persistent low-grade loneliness in your presence that has nothing to do with how much time you spend together, and everything to do with how little of you actually shows up during that time. Here's a distinction that matters enormously, and gets collapsed constantly. There's a difference between being loved and being approved of. Approval can be earned by the ambassador. Love, the real kind, the kind that survives disagreement and disappointment and still stays, can only be extended to the person who actually shows up. If you've spent years sending the ambassador instead, you may have accumulated an enormous amount of approval while quietly starving for the specific, irreplaceable experience of being loved as yourself. These feel similar from a distance. Up close, they are almost nothing alike, and the difference explains a particular kind of hollowness that some people carry even inside marriages, friendships, and families that look, from the outside, entirely secure. There's a third cost, and this one is the most difficult to face honestly because it implicates the very people you might otherwise blame for the whole situation. Every time you accommodated instead of speaking your original position, you deprived the people around you of the chance to actually know you, and in doing so, you deprived them of the chance to choose you, the real one, rather than the curated one. Some of those people would have stayed regardless. Some might not have. You genuinely don't know, and that not knowing is itself a cost, a permanent gap in your understanding of who actually loves you versus who has simply never been given reason not to. Consider the professional version of this same arithmetic. You've likely spent years contributing competent, well-received, thoroughly unremarkable work in rooms where you privately believed a different, riskier approach would have served better. That instinct, buried under years of forecasted disapproval, represents actual value that never entered the world. Not because you lacked the ability to produce it, but because you calculated, correctly in the short term and expensively in the long term, that the safer contribution would cost you less. Multiply that calculation across a decade of meetings, and you begin to understand why so many accomplished people privately suspect they've never done their best work, without being able to say exactly why. The why is rarely lack of talent. It's usually a long accumulation of talent quietly declined in favor of talent approved. None of this is offered to induce despair, though it's fair if something in you resists reading it plainly. The alternative to facing this cost honestly isn't a neutral continuation of the status quo. It's a slow compounding deepening of exactly the pattern already described, because costs that go unexamined don't stay flat. They accrue interest. The person who avoids this reckoning at 35 faces a steeper version of the same reckoning at 50, with fewer years left to spend rebuilding what the avoidance cost. There is, however, something genuinely useful buried inside this difficult accounting, and it's worth sitting with before moving forward. The cost you've paid was not paid stupidly. It was paid for something real, safety, belonging, a version of love that, however incomplete, still mattered and still sustained you through years you needed sustaining. This isn't a story about a fool who threw away something valuable for nothing. It's a story about a reasonable person who made a reasonable trade under conditions that made the trade feel necessary, and who is only now, with more resources and more clarity than existed at the time, in a position to ask whether that trade still makes sense. That's the question this chapter leaves you holding, not as an indictment, but as an honest tally, finally itemized instead of vague. You know now roughly what the substitution has cost. What you don't yet know is what happens when you stop paying it. And that uncertainty, uncomfortable as it is exactly where the next part of this journey begins. There's one more cost worth naming before this chapter closes, because it's the one most easily overlooked in a tally focused on relationships and career. Consider what the years of substitution have cost your capacity for pleasure itself, the simple ability to want something and say so without first calculating whether the wanting will be well received. Somewhere along the way, even your preferences, the small ones, what you'd like to eat, how you'd like to spend a free afternoon, what kind of vacation actually appeals to you, may have started passing through the same filter as your opinions and your disagreements. That filtering doesn't announce itself as loss. It simply narrows, slowly, the range of things you allow yourself to want out loud, until the distance between your private wanting and your public wanting becomes so wide that even you struggle to remember which one is real. This particular cost is worth sitting with a moment longer than the others, because it's the one most likely to go entirely undetected until this very sentence. You may not have realized until reading it just now how long it's been since you wanted something plainly, without first running it past the version of yourself that manages everyone else's comfort. That's not a small thing to notice. It's the clearest possible evidence that the tally in this chapter was never abstract. It's been running quietly against your actual life this entire time. Chapter 6. Why the Previous Attempts Failed. This isn't your first attempt at this. It's worth admitting that plainly before going any further. There was a version of you at some point who tried. Maybe it was a resolution made on a specific date. Maybe it was a quieter, more private decision made after a conversation that finally went too far. You decided with real conviction that things would be different. You would speak up. You would stop editing yourself into agreement. And for a stretch of days, maybe even weeks, something did shift. Then it didn't. The old pattern returned, not with any dramatic reversal, but the way water returns to its lowest point, quietly, almost without you noticing the exact moment the return began. If you're carrying any shame about that failure, this chapter has one purpose: to remove it, by showing you precisely why it wasn't a failure of will. The first reason previous attempts collapsed is that they targeted the wrong layer of the mechanism. Recall the anatomy from a few chapters back. Detection, substitution, reinforcement. Most people who try to change this pattern aim their effort at substitution, the moment where the original instinct gets swapped for the palatable one. They tell themselves, Next time I'll say what I actually think instead of the safer version. This sounds like a plan. It rarely survives contact with an actual room, because by the time substitution occurs, detection has already run its course, and the forecast has already shaped the emotional terrain you're standing on. Trying to override substitution through willpower alone is like trying to stop a wave after it's already broken. The energy determining the outcome was spent upstream, in a process too fast to intercept at the point most people are aiming. The second reason is more uncomfortable to name, because it requires admitting that willpower, on its own, is a much weaker force than most self-improvement culture wants you to believe. Willpower is a finite resource, drawn down by ordinary demands throughout the day: fatigue, hunger, the accumulated friction of decisions made since morning. The moments that most require your original instinct to surface, a tense meeting, a difficult conversation with someone you love, a decision made under scrutiny, are precisely the moments when your willpower reserves are lowest, because those moments are themselves depleting. You weren't weak for failing to hold the line in that argument at 9 at night. You were operating on a resource that had already been spent by 6. Consider a distinction that clarifies why so many change attempts collapse under this exact pressure. There's a difference between motivation and infrastructure. Motivation is a feeling, and feelings are notoriously unreliable under stress, precisely the conditions in which you need reliability most. Infrastructure is a structure built in advance, during a calm moment, designed to function even when motivation has nothing left to offer. Most previous attempts at this change relied entirely on motivation, a surge of resolve generated in a reflective evening or after a moving conversation, and asked that surge to carry weight. It was never built to carry days or weeks later, under entirely different conditions. The attempt didn't fail because your resolve was fake. It failed because resolve, unsupported by any structure, degrades on a predictable timeline, the same way any unsupported weight eventually does. There's a third failure point worth naming honestly, because it involves other people, and most self-help narratives avoid this part entirely. When you first attempt to speak from your original instinct instead of the socially calibrated one, the people around you, the ones who built years of comfortable expectations around your accommodating version, will often push back, sometimes without even realizing they're doing it. A friend who's used to your easy agreement might respond to your first real disagreement with visible surprise, maybe hurt, maybe a subtle campaign to restore the old dynamic because the old dynamic served them too. This isn't malice most of the time, it's homeostasis. Systems resist change, including relationship systems, and your first attempts likely encountered resistance you interpreted as evidence you were doing something wrong, when in fact it was evidence you were doing something different, which is not the same thing. Ask yourself honestly, what happened the last time you tried to hold a boundary with someone who wasn't used to you holding one? Did the discomfort you felt come entirely from inside you, or did some of it arrive from outside? From a subtle recalibration of tone, a slightly cooler response, an unspoken signal that you'd stepped outside your assigned role. If some of that discomfort came from outside, then your previous attempt didn't fail because you lacked conviction. It failed because you were fighting a two-front battle, your own habituated fear on one side, and the genuine resistance of a system that had organized itself around your old behavior on the other. And you were fighting both fronts with a strategy built for neither. There's a final reason worth naming, and it's perhaps the most important one, because it points toward what actually needs to happen next, rather than simply explaining the past. Previous attempts likely tried to change the pattern all at once, in every room, with every person, starting immediately. This ambition feels virtuous. It's also, almost without exception, a recipe for collapse, because a mechanism built over decades doesn't yield to an intervention improvised over a weekend. The muscle described earlier, the one atrophied through years of disuse, cannot be asked to lift its full eventual capacity on its first outing. It needs smaller loads first, chosen deliberately, practiced in lower-stakes rooms, before it's asked to hold in the rooms that matter most. None of this was a failure of character. It was a mismatch between the size of the problem and the size of the tool applied to it. You brought motivation to a problem that required infrastructure. You aimed at substitution when the real leverage point sits earlier, at detection. You expected the system around you to welcome a change it hadn't agreed to, and you tried to lift the full weight before the muscle had done any smaller repetitions. Every one of those mismatches is fixable, and fixing them doesn't require more willpower than you already have. It requires a different design, one this narrative is about to hand you, piece by piece, starting with the very next chapter. There's one more thing worth saying about failure before this chapter hands you off to the work ahead. Every previous attempt, however short-lived, left something behind that the current attempt gets to build on, even if it didn't feel that way at the time. Each false start taught your nervous system, in small increments, that speaking honestly doesn't actually end in catastrophe, even when it ended in retreat. That residue doesn't disappear just because the attempt itself didn't hold. It accumulates quietly underneath the surface, the way sediment builds before it ever becomes visible ground. And it's part of why this attempt, informed by an honest accounting of why the others didn't stick, has a real chance of becoming the one that finally does. That ground is already more solid than you think. Chapter 7. The First Real Movement. Somewhere in the last 6 chapters, something in you has already started to shift, even if nothing outward has changed yet. This chapter gives that shift its first deliberate action. The fragment that works, the smallest possible unit of the change this book is describing, isn't a grand confrontation or a dramatic act of honesty delivered to the person who most needs to hear it. It's much smaller than that, and its smallness is precisely why it succeeds where previous attempts, built on ambition alone, collapsed. The fragment is this. Notice the moment of detection, the split second before substitution occurs, and simply pause inside it. Not act differently yet. Not speak the unfiltered thought. Just notice, in real time, that the swap is about to happen, and let that noticing exist for 1 extra second before the pattern completes itself. This sounds almost too small to matter, and that reaction is worth examining rather than dismissed, because the instinct to demand something bigger is exactly the instinct that sank previous attempts. You want dramatic. Dramatic feels like proof that something real is happening. But dramatic, as established in the last chapter, requires resources you don't reliably have in the moments that matter most. The pause requires almost nothing. It doesn't ask you to say the difficult thing. It only asks you to notice, for 1 extra second, that you're about to not say it. That noticing is the entire fragment, and it works precisely because it's cheap enough to survive contact with an actual imperfect day. Here's why this small pause carries more weight than its size suggests. Recall that the mechanism runs on reinforcement, that every successful substitution logs itself as evidence the substitution was correct, deepening the groove a little further each time. The pause interrupts that loop not by preventing the substitution, at least not yet, but by inserting a witness into a process that has run, until now, entirely without one. The first several times you practice this, you'll likely still choose the safer, socially calibrated answer. That's fine. That's expected. The point of this first movement isn't to override the pattern immediately. It's to become the kind of person who notices the pattern operating in real time, because noticing is the precondition for every subsequent change, and you cannot skip it no matter how badly you want to. Distinguish this clearly from mere self-monitoring, the anxious, exhausting habit of narrating your own behavior with judgment attached. That's not what's being asked of you here. Self-monitoring says, "I did it again. I always do this. What's wrong with me?" The pause this chapter is describing says nothing at all. It simply observes, without commentary, the way you might notice weather changing outside a window, a fact registered without a verdict attached. The difference matters enormously. Because judgment recruits shame, and shame, contrary to what many people assume, doesn't accelerate change. It exhausts the very resource, self-trust, that change actually depends on. Consider what this looks like inside an ordinary moment. Someone asks your opinion of a decision you privately think is a mistake. In the old pattern, detection runs, a favorable-sounding answer forms, and you deliver it. All in under a second, with no gap you were consciously aware of. In this new practice, that same sequence begins to run, but somewhere in the middle, you catch it. You notice, silently, that a softer answer is forming and that it isn't your original one. You might still deliver the softer answer. That's allowed this early. What's different is that you now know you did it, in the moment, rather than realizing it hours later, if at all. That knowing is the fragment. It's small. It's also the first piece of infrastructure this journey is built on. And infrastructure, unlike motivation, doesn't degrade the way resolve does, because it isn't asking anything of your willpower. It's only asking you to look. There's a particular kind of relief available here, and it's worth naming because most people don't expect it. Once you stop demanding of yourself the dramatic version of change, the confrontation, the speech, the boundary held perfectly on the first attempt, the pressure that made previous attempts so exhausting simply lifts. You're not failing every time you notice the pattern and still choose the old response. You're succeeding at the only task actually assigned to you at this stage, which is noticing itself. This reframing does something previous attempts never managed. It makes the practice sustainable on an ordinary Tuesday, not just on the reflective evening when you first decided to change. Practice this for a week before expecting anything more of yourself. Notice the pause in low-stakes rooms first, a minor preference at a restaurant, an opinion about something that doesn't matter much either way. Let the muscle described in earlier chapters take its first small repetitions where the weight is light enough not to strain anything. You are not yet being asked to hold a boundary with someone whose reaction genuinely frightens you. You are only being asked to notice, clearly and without judgment, the exact second your instinct starts to disappear behind something more presentable. Something changes the moment you can reliably catch that second. The mechanism stops running entirely in the dark. It still runs, most of the time, exactly as it always has. But now there's a light on somewhere in the room, however dim, and a mechanism that's been seen even once can never again claim the total invisibility it depended on to operate unquestioned. That's the entire achievement this chapter asks of you. Not courage yet, just a witness, present at the scene, taking notes. There's a distinction worth drawing here, because it's easy to confuse the pause with something that only resembles it. Hesitation, born of fear, looks almost identical to the pause described in this chapter, and yet the two point in opposite directions. Fear-based hesitation keeps you frozen, unable to answer at all, caught between the instinct and the substitution with no resolution either way. The pause this chapter is training is different. It doesn't ask you to freeze, it asks you to notice while still moving forward, still answering, still functioning in the room, but with a small internal light switched on that wasn't on before. One version leaves you stuck. The other leaves you exactly where you were, still delivering the same answer for now, except aware, for the first time, that a choice occurred where you used to assume there was none. Picture the scene concretely because concreteness is what makes a fragment usable rather than theoretical. You're standing in a kitchen, someone you love has just proposed a plan you have real doubts about, and you feel the familiar internal current already pulling toward agreement before you've said a single word. In the old pattern, that pull simply becomes your mouth, seamlessly, and the agreement arrives as though it had always been the plan. In this new practice, you feel the same pull, but somewhere underneath it, quieter. There's a second sensation now, a kind of internal tap on the shoulder that says, "This is the moment. This is the swap happening right now." You may still say yes, but you said it having felt the mechanism work. rather than having been entirely run by it without your knowledge. This is worth returning to daily, not as a discipline that demands perfect execution, but as a practice that only asks for repetition. Some days you'll catch the pause easily, in rooms that don't matter much. Other days it will slip past you entirely, in exactly the conversation where it mattered most. And you'll only notice afterward, replaying the exchange later that night. That's not failure. That's the muscle still building strength it didn't have last month. The fragment isn't measured by how often it succeeds in changing your answer. It's measured by how often you notice the moment exists at all. And that number, tracked honestly over weeks rather than days, only moves in one direction once you've started paying attention. Chapter 8. The Internal Resistance. The first time you actually hold the pause long enough to answer honestly instead of safely, something unexpected happens. It doesn't feel like victory. It feels like danger. This surprises almost everyone who reaches this stage, because every account of change you've absorbed from books, from films, from the general cultural mythology of self-improvement, told you that the moment of finally speaking your true position would feel like relief, like a held breath finally released. Sometimes it does. More often, especially the first several times, it feels like standing at the edge of something with no clear floor beneath it. Your chest tight, your voice slightly unfamiliar in your own ears. A rushing sense that you've just done something your body is convinced is unsafe, even though your mind, quite calmly, knows better. This isn't a sign you're doing it wrong. It's the resistance arriving exactly on schedule, and it deserves to be understood rather than fled from. Name what's actually happening physiologically, because naming it correctly changes your relationship to it entirely. The system responsible for detecting social danger doesn't distinguish particularly well between a genuine threat to your survival and a threat to your standing within a group, because for most of human history, those two things were functionally identical. When you speak your original instinct instead of the calibrated substitute, that ancient system registers the deviation and floods you with exactly the response it would generate for a more literal danger. Elevated heart rate, a tightening across the chest, an urge to immediately soften what you just said, to walk it back, to add a qualifier that dilutes it back toward safety. This isn't weakness. It's an old alarm system doing its job with more force than the situation actually requires. And understanding that gap between the alarm's intensity and the real stakes involved is the first tool for getting through it without retreating. There's a distinction worth making here, because collapsing it is precisely what sends people backward at this stage. There's a difference between resistance and evidence. Resistance is the discomfort itself, the racing pulse, the urge to retract. Evidence would be an actual negative consequence, a friend who leaves, a job that's lost, a relationship that ends because you finally said what you meant. Most people, feeling resistance, treat it as though it were evidence, concluding from the discomfort alone that the honest position was a mistake, and retreating back into the calibrated version before any actual consequence has even had time to occur. The discomfort arrives whether or not anything bad is about to happen. It's not a reliable predictor of outcome. It's simply what it feels like, physiologically, to do something your nervous system has been trained for years to treat as unsafe. Consider what this looks like inside an actual conversation. You tell your partner for the first time in longer than you'd like to admit that a plan they've proposed doesn't work for you, stated plainly, without the usual cushioning. The words leave your mouth and immediately your instinct is to chase them with an apology, an explanation, a softening addendum that undoes half of what you just said. That chase, that urge to retract, is the resistance arriving in real time, and it will arrive nearly every time for a while, regardless of how the other person actually responds. Learning to let the original statement stand without immediately padding it is one of the hardest and most important skills this stage requires, because the padding, however small, is often enough to signal to everyone involved, including yourself, that the honest version wasn't fully meant. There's a further layer to the resistance that's rarely discussed honestly. It doesn't only come from within you. It can come from the room itself, in the form of a pause that lasts a beat too long, a slightly cooler tone in the response that follows, a flicker of surprise on a face that's grown used to your agreement. This external reaction, when it happens, tends to arrive far smaller and far less catastrophic than your internal alarm predicted. But it does often happen, at least in some small form, because the people around you built expectations around your old pattern, and those expectations don't dissolve instantly just because you've decided to stop meeting them. Distinguish this small friction from actual rejection. A raised eyebrow is not abandonment. A moment of surprised silence is not the end of a relationship. Most of what you'll encounter at this stage is exactly this scale: uncomfortable, survivable, and nowhere near as dangerous as the alarm inside you insists it is. There's an important honesty required here, because this chapter has no interest in pretending the resistance is purely imaginary. Sometimes, speaking your original instinct does cost you something real. A colleague might respond less warmly. A friend might need time to recalibrate a dynamic that had worked well for them precisely because you never pushed back. This is the genuine price of the change described across this book, and pretending it doesn't exist would be its own kind of dishonesty. What can be said truthfully is that this price is almost always smaller, and almost always more survivable, than the price you've already been paying in the previous chapters. The slow accumulation of self-erasure that costs you something every single day, rather than in occasional identifiable moments you can actually see and evaluate. The resistance doesn't disappear with practice, so much as it becomes familiar, and familiarity changes its character considerably. The 10th time you hold your position through the tightening chest, and the urge to retract, the sensation is still there, but it no longer arrives with the same conviction that something is going wrong. You begin to recognize it the way you'd recognize weather, a storm passing through a body that has learned through repetition that storms like this one pass. That recognition is not the same as comfort. It is something more useful than comfort. It is trust, built the only way trust is ever actually built, through enough repeated evidence that you survive the thing you were afraid of. What the resistance is asking of you, underneath all its noise, is not to disappear. It's asking to be felt without being obeyed. The two have been fused together for so long in your experience that separating them may be the single most important skill this stage of the work requires. And every time you feel the alarm and act anyway, not recklessly, not without care, but honestly, you weaken the fusion a little further, until one day the alarm sounds and you notice it, register it, and continue speaking anyway, no longer mistaking its volume for its accuracy. There's one more distinction worth drawing before this chapter closes, because it separates people who move through this stage from people who get permanently stuck inside it. Some mistake the goal here for the elimination of resistance entirely, waiting for a day when speaking honestly will finally feel easy, calm, free of the tightening chest and the racing pulse. That day may never fully arrive, and waiting for it is its own trap, a new excuse dressed in the language of readiness. The actual goal isn't a resistance-free future. It's a future where the resistance shows up, gets acknowledged, and no longer gets the final vote. You are not being asked to stop feeling afraid. You are being asked to keep speaking anyway, afraid, which is the only version of courage that was ever actually available to anyone. Chapter 9. Application under low energy. Nobody tests you at their best. The pattern always comes for you at the end of a long day, when your defenses are already spent, and the old response is simply easier than the new one. This is the part of the work most previous attempts never accounted for, and it's worth naming plainly, because it explains a specific kind of collapse that feels like a mystery until you see the mechanics behind it. You practice the pause in calm moments, in low-stakes rooms, on days when you had reserves to spare. That practice was necessary, and it worked exactly as intended. But the pattern this book is dismantling didn't build itself in calm moments. It built itself disproportionately in exhausted ones, at the end of long days, in the middle of arguments that had already gone on too long, in the 10th request of a week that had already asked too much of you. If your new practice only shows up when conditions are favorable, it will consistently lose to a pattern that was specifically forged to thrive when conditions are not. Consider what actually happens to your capacity for original thought as the day wears on. Decision fatigue is real, and it doesn't discriminate between trivial choices and important ones. By evening, after a day of ordinary demands, meetings navigated, minor conflicts smoothed over, 1,000 small calibrations made without your full awareness, the resource that supports the pause, the noticing, the willingness to hold an honest position through discomfort, has been drawn down considerably. This is precisely why the most important conversations in a life so often happen badly. Not because the stakes chose a bad time, because the stakes and the depletion arrive together almost every time, and the depletion wins by default unless something has been built in advance to compensate for it. Here's a distinction that matters enormously at this stage. There's a difference between low energy and low capacity. Low energy is simply tiredness, a state that fluctuates hour by hour and day by day, and it's not something you can eliminate through effort. Low capacity is what happens when low energy is left completely unsupported, when nothing exists to catch you the moment your reserves run out. You cannot fix low energy. Everyone runs low sometimes, and pretending otherwise is a losing strategy this book has no interest in offering you. What you can fix is the unsupported part, by building something small and reliable enough that it still functions when your best self has already gone to bed. That something is smaller than you'd expect, and its smallness, again, is the entire point. A single sentence, memorized in advance, during a calm moment, that you can deploy without needing fresh willpower to generate it on the spot. Something like, "Let me think about that and get back to you," or, "I need a minute before I answer that." These sentences do a specific and important job. They don't require you to produce your original instinct under depleted conditions. They only require you to buy time until conditions improve. And buying time is a far smaller ask than answering honestly on command at your lowest point. The sentence isn't the answer. It's a bridge to a moment when you'll actually have access to your answer. Consider what this looks like in practice, on an evening when you have nothing left. Someone raises a request, or an opinion, or a plan, at exactly the moment you're least equipped to respond from your original instinct, rather than the exhausted path of least resistance version of yourself. In the old pattern, exhaustion simply produces agreement, because agreement is the cheapest available response, and cheap is what depletion reaches for. In this practice, exhaustion produces the bridge sentence instead, learned and rehearsed enough that it doesn't require willpower to access, only memory. You don't answer honestly in that moment. You postpone the answer to a moment when honesty is actually available to you, and that postponement, small as it sounds, is the entire difference between a decision made by your values and a decision made by your fatigue. There's a further piece of infrastructure worth building here, and it concerns not the moment itself, but the conditions surrounding it. Notice which parts of your week reliably leave you running on empty, and notice whether the conversations that matter most keep landing inside those depleted windows by accident or by pattern. Some of this is genuinely unavoidable. Life doesn't always schedule its hardest moments for when you're rested, but some of it is more avoidable than it appears, and a small amount of deliberate protection, declining one more obligation on a day that's already full, moving a difficult conversation to a morning instead of a midnight, can shift the odds meaningfully in your favor without requiring any additional courage at all. There's an honest limit to what this chapter can promise. You will still, on some occasions, be caught at your lowest point by something that cannot wait, And in those moments, the old pattern will sometimes win, not because you failed, but because depletion is a real physical constraint and not a moral failing to be willed away. What matters isn't a perfect record. What matters is that the collapse, when it happens, doesn't compound into shame that erodes the progress made everywhere else. A single exhausted evening where the old pattern reasserted itself is data, not verdict. The muscle described across earlier chapters doesn't lose its strength because of one heavy day. It loses strength only when heavy days become the excuse for abandoning the practice altogether. The deepest test of any real change isn't whether it holds up on your best day. It's whether it holds up on an ordinary Tuesday when nothing has gone especially wrong and nothing has gone especially right, when you are simply tired in the unremarkable way most days leave you tired. And the old, easier response is sitting right there, requiring nothing of you at all. Building something that survives that ordinary Tuesday, not through heroic effort but through a small rehearsed bridge that doesn't need your best self to function, is what separates a change that lasts from a change that only ever worked in the version of your life you don't actually live. There's one more mechanism worth naming before this chapter closes, because it explains why the bridge sentence works even better than it first appears to. Buying time doesn't only protect you from answering badly in the moment. It also changes the shape of the eventual answer, because the person who responds an hour later or the next morning after actual rest is not the same cognitive version of you who was asked the question at 9 at night. Given even a small amount of recovery, your original instinct tends to resurface with more clarity than it had access to under depletion. Not because time heals anything mystical, but because the resource it was missing simply had a chance to partially refill. This is why the postponement isn't a lesser version of honesty. It's often the only route to a version of honesty depletion had already made unreachable. Chapter 10. The Relational Dimension. You don't practice this alone. Every attempt to reclaim your original instinct happens inside a web of other people, and some of them, without meaning any harm, are going to make the practice significantly harder than it would be in isolation. This is worth stating plainly because most self-improvement narratives treat change as a solo project, something that happens inside one person's willpower, unaffected by the ecosystem that person actually lives in. That framing is convenient and mostly false. You exist inside relationships that have their own momentum, their own established roles, their own quiet expectations about who says what and who yields when. Changing your half of that arrangement doesn't happen in a vacuum. It happens in front of an audience that has opinions about the old version of you, opinions they may not even be aware of holding until the old version stops showing up. Start with the most common relational obstacle, the one that catches almost everyone off guard the first time it appears. Someone close to you, a partner, a parent, a longtime friend, has built years of comfortable interaction around your agreeableness, not maliciously, simply because it worked, because your accommodation made their life smoother in ways they never had to examine closely. When you begin holding your original position instead of the calibrated one, that person may respond with something between confusion and quiet resistance, not because they've stopped loving you, but because a system they'd stopped noticing has just changed its terms without warning them first. Here's a distinction worth holding carefully, because collapsing it leads people to abandon the work at exactly the point it starts mattering. There's a difference between someone who resists your change because they benefit from your old pattern, and someone who resists because the change genuinely startles them, and they simply need time to recalibrate. The first case requires you to hold your ground regardless of the discomfort it causes them, because their comfort was never a fair price for your self-erasure. The second case requires patience, not retreat, because a person who loves you can absolutely adjust to a truer version of you, given enough consistent evidence that this version is not a phase, but a permanent shift. Mistaking the second case for the first turns people who would have adapted into casualties of your own premature certainty. Mistaking the first case for the second keeps you trapped in relationships that were only ever comfortable because you weren't fully present in them. Consider how this plays out with someone specific. A friend who has relied on you for years to be the one who goes along with the plan, defers on the restaurant, absorbs the small frictions so the group doesn't have to. The first time you decline to play that role, something in the dynamic wobbles. This wobble is not evidence the friendship was fragile. It's evidence the friendship was, in this particular respect, unbalanced. And unbalanced things wobble when weight shifts, regardless of how sound the underlying structure actually is. Most friendships survive this wobble easily, once the new balance settles. Some don't, and that outcome, while painful, is information you needed rather than a tragedy to be avoided at any cost. There's a particular relational cost worth naming honestly, because previous chapters focused mostly on the cost to you, and this one concerns the cost to others, specifically the discomfort of watching someone they love change in ways that require them to change too. This isn't your responsibility to prevent. It is, however, worth extending some real compassion toward, because the people around you didn't sign up for a version of you that suddenly asks more of them, requires more negotiation, holds more positions that need to be actually discussed rather than assumed. Their adjustment period is real. Giving them some room inside it without abandoning your own position to shorten their discomfort is possible. And it's a more mature response than either steamrolling their adjustment or collapsing back into the old pattern to avoid causing it. There's a further layer worth examining, one that concerns your own participation in maintaining other people's patterns. Just as you've spent years substituting your original instinct for a socially calibrated one, you may have unknowingly trained the people around you to expect that substitution as a permanent feature of your personality. This means your change asks something of them too, a willingness to update a model of you that's been accurate for years and is now gradually becoming less so. Some people update models easily. Others hold on to outdated ones with surprising tenacity, not out of malice, but because updating requires effort. They didn't expect to need to spend on a relationship they'd already filed as settled. Watch closely during this stage for the specific people who respond to your new honesty with genuine curiosity rather than resistance, who ask what's changed, who seem interested in getting to know a version of you they hadn't fully met before. These responses are worth noticing and remembering, because they tell you something important about which relationships in your life were actually built on you, the real one, and which were built primarily on the ambassador you'd been sending in your place. Both kinds of relationships can be real, but only one kind can survive what you're doing now, and finding out which is which, while uncomfortable, is not a side effect of this work. It's one of its most valuable outcomes. The relational dimension of this change will test you in ways the earlier, more solitary chapters didn't. It's one thing to notice your own pattern in the quiet of your own reflection. It's another to hold your honest position while someone you love visibly struggles with the shift, their face doing something you're not used to seeing, their voice carrying a note of hurt or confusion you'd usually have smoothed over by now. Holding steady through that moment, without either abandoning your position or weaponizing it, is one of the more advanced skills this journey asks of you, and it's worth remembering, in the middle of that discomfort, that you are not causing harm by finally showing up as yourself. You are simply making visible a cost that was always there, previously paid quietly, by you alone, and now, for the first time, shared honestly between two people capable of actually working it out together. There's one more variable worth accounting for before this chapter closes, because it changes how quickly the relational turbulence settles. Consistency, more than intensity, is what convinces the people around you that this change is permanent, rather than a passing mood. A single dramatic assertion of your honest position, followed by a retreat back into the old pattern the next time discomfort arrives, teaches the people around you the opposite lesson from the one you intended. It teaches them that the old version of you is still the reliable default, and that the new version only surfaces under specific, unpredictable conditions. Steady, unremarkable repetition, holding the same honest position in small moments, week after week, does more to shift a relationship's architecture than any single confrontation ever could, precisely because it's the kind of evidence that a nervous system, yours or theirs, actually learns to trust. Chapter 11. The Oldest Root. This pattern didn't start with you. It started somewhere further back, in a room you may not even remember clearly, learned so early that it feels less like something you acquired and more like something you simply are. Most people, when they finally trace their pattern of self-erasure back to its origin, expect to find a single dramatic event, a specific moment of humiliation or rejection, sharp enough to explain everything that followed. Sometimes that moment exists. More often, the root is quieter and more diffuse than that, built not from one wound, but from 1,000 small, repeated signals absorbed over years of childhood, each one small enough to leave no obvious scar. All of them together forming a conclusion no child could have articulated, but every child could feel. That a certain version of you, the unfiltered, unpolished, occasionally difficult version, was not the version that earned the warmest response. Consider how early this learning happens, well before language could have named it, in the earliest interactions between a child and the adults responsible for that child's safety. A child who expresses an inconvenient feeling and receives warmth learns, at the deepest possible level, that inconvenient feelings are survivable to express. A child who expresses that same feeling and receives withdrawal, irritation, or a change in the emotional temperature of the room learns something equally deep, something that predates conscious memory entirely. That this particular feeling, expressed this particular way, comes with a cost to connection. Neither lesson requires cruelty to take hold. Ordinary well-meaning parents, exhausted and doing their best under real constraints, teach this second lesson constantly, without any intention of doing harm, simply because managing a child's difficult feelings under difficult circumstances is hard, and withdrawal is often the path of least resistance available to an adult who is themselves running low. Here's a distinction worth making carefully, because getting it wrong leads either to unfair blame or to a dead end, where no explanation feels adequate. There's a difference between a childhood that caused this pattern deliberately and a childhood that simply failed to interrupt a pattern that forms, to some degree, in almost every developing person raised inside a social species. You are not required to locate a villain in this story for the pattern to be real, and searching for one, when none exists, can become its own kind of avoidance, a way of staying angry at a specific person, instead of doing the quieter, harder work of understanding a system that produced this outcome without anyone intending it. Trace the pattern forward from that early root and notice how naturally it compounds. A child who learns that certain expressions cost connection doesn't simply stop expressing them once. That child builds, often unconsciously and with real ingenuity, an entire early warning system designed to detect the conditions under which those expressions become unsafe, and to substitute something more acceptable before the risk can materialize. This is essentially the same detection and substitution mechanism described several chapters ago, except now you can see where it was first assembled, and why it was assembled with such sophistication. It wasn't built recently, under ordinary adult pressures. It was built decades ago, under conditions where a child's actual safety, emotional and sometimes literal, depended on getting the calibration right. This origin matters enormously for how you relate to the pattern now, because a mechanism built for genuine survival deserves a very different response than a mechanism dismissed as simple bad habit. You are not fighting laziness or poor discipline when you work to interrupt this pattern. You are renegotiating with a system that once did real, necessary work, keeping a smaller, more vulnerable version of you safe inside conditions that actually required exactly this kind of vigilance. Approaching that system with contempt, treating it as something to be crushed or overridden through sheer force, tends to backfire, because the system was never irrational. It was a reasonable adaptation to real conditions that, crucially, no longer apply in the same way. Ask yourself honestly what the earliest version of this pattern was protecting you from, specifically. Not in vague terms, but concretely, if you can access it. Was it a parent's temper, unpredictable enough that vigilance felt necessary for actual safety? Was it a more subtle withdrawal of warmth, no less real for being quiet? Was it a household where a certain kind of child, easy, undemanding, agreeable, received more affection than the alternative, teaching you early which version of yourself to lead with? Whatever the specific shape, naming it concretely does something important. It moves the pattern out of the realm of vague personal failing and into the realm of a specific, comprehensible response to specific, comprehensible conditions, which makes it something you can finally examine with clarity instead of shame. There's a further recognition worth sitting with, uncomfortable as it is. The conditions that built this pattern, in most cases, no longer exist in your current life, even though the pattern continues operating as though they do. The parent whose mood once required careful management may no longer be in the room, may have softened considerably with age, may even be gone entirely, and still the old vigilance runs, scanning current rooms for a danger that current rooms rarely actually contain. This is the nature of deeply learned survival mechanisms. They don't come with expiration dates. They keep running long after the original threat has dissolved, because the nervous system that built them has no built-in mechanism for periodically checking whether the original conditions still apply. Recognizing the root doesn't dissolve the pattern by itself, and it would be dishonest to promise that it does. But it changes something important about how the remaining work feels. You are no longer trying to fix a flaw in your character. You are updating an old, outdated map, drawn accurately for a territory you don't live in anymore, and updating an outdated map is a fundamentally different task than repairing something broken. The map was never broken. It was simply drawn for somewhere you left a long time ago, and it's past time it learned the shape of where you actually live now. There's one more piece worth adding before this chapter closes, because it prevents a common misstep at this stage. Understanding the root of the pattern is not the same as excusing every adult who contributed to it, and it is also not a demand that you excuse them. You are permitted to hold both truths at once, that the conditions were understandable given the constraints the adults around you were operating under, and that the impact on you was real and deserves acknowledgement on its own terms. Compassion for the origin does not require you to minimize the cost. It only asks you to stop treating that cost as evidence of something wrong with you, and to start treating it as evidence of something that happened to you, which is a considerably easier thing to finally set down. That distinction, small as it sounds, is often the exact hinge on which the rest of this work turns. It is the difference between a life spent atoning for a fault that was never yours, and a life spent simply, finally, tending to a wound that has already earned its healing. Chapter 12. Why Progress Disappears. 3 weeks in, something that felt solid starts to feel questionable again. You catch yourself back in the old pattern, agreeing when you meant to pause, softening when you meant to hold firm, and the progress that felt so real just days ago now feels like something you might have imagined. This is not a sign that the work failed. It's one of the most predictable and least discussed phases of any real change, and understanding why it happens is what determines whether you interpret it correctly or use it as evidence to quit. Progress in a pattern this deeply rooted was never going to move in a straight line, because the pattern itself doesn't operate on a straight line. It operates on context, on energy, on the specific people and pressures present in any given moment. and a change that holds beautifully in one context can simply not yet exist in another. Not because the earlier gains were fake, but because change generalizes slowly, one context at a time, unless something is done to protect it deliberately. Here's the mechanism worth understanding clearly. Early progress usually happens in the contexts where it's easiest, the low-stakes rooms, the calmer relationships, the moments when you had energy to spare. That progress is real. It's also narrow, confined to the specific conditions under which it was built, and it doesn't automatically transfer to harder contexts, higher stakes, more depleted energy, relationships with more history and more resistance built into them. When the pattern reappears in one of those harder contexts, it can feel like total regression, like everything built over the previous weeks has simply evaporated. It hasn't evaporated. It was never installed there in the first place, and mistaking absence for loss is one of the most common ways people abandon work that was actually still on schedule. There's a distinction worth drawing here, because collapsing it is what turns a normal plateau into an actual abandonment of the work. There's a difference between regression and incomplete coverage. Regression would mean the gains you made in easier contexts have started reversing, that rooms where you'd successfully held your position are now reverting to the old pattern too. Incomplete coverage means the gains you made are holding exactly where you built them, and the pattern is simply still running unchallenged in contexts you haven't yet brought your new practice into. Most of what people experience as regression at this stage is actually the second thing, and the distinction matters enormously, because one calls for despair and the other simply calls for more coverage, deliberately extended into the next context, one at a time. Consider what protects progress once it's been made, because progress, unlike a fixed achievement, requires ongoing maintenance, or it tends to erode back toward whatever pattern has the deepest grooves already worn into it. The old pattern has decades of repetition behind it. The new one has weeks. Left to compete purely on the strength of existing habit, the older pattern will win far more often than the newer one. Not because the newer one is weaker in principle, but because habit strength is largely a function of repetition count, and the count is lopsided by a wide margin. This is exactly why structure matters more at this stage than motivation. Motivation got you started. Structure is what keeps early gains from quietly eroding while your attention is elsewhere, occupied by the ordinary demands of an ordinary life that doesn't pause to let your new pattern finish consolidating. What structure actually looks like here is smaller and more concrete than the word might suggest. A brief, honest check at the end of each week, not a performance review, just a quiet accounting of where the pause held and where it didn't done. Done without judgment, purely as data collection. Naming explicitly which specific relationship or context you're going to extend the practice into next, rather than leaving the expansion to chance. Returning when a setback occurs, not to self-criticism but to curiosity about which condition, exhaustion, a particular person, a particular kind of request, made that moment harder than the ones where the practice held. This isn't complicated. It's also precisely the kind of unglamorous maintenance most people skip, because it doesn't feel like progress the way a single dramatic breakthrough does. And skipping it is exactly how early gains quietly dissolve without anyone noticing until months later, when the whole pattern feels like it never changed at all. There's a further trap worth naming honestly, because it catches people who are otherwise doing everything right. Some interpret any recurrence of the old pattern as proof the entire underlying belief was wrong, that maybe they were never really capable of this change, that the early success was a fluke rather than a foundation. This interpretation feels reasonable in the moment and is almost always false. A single recurrence tells you about one context under specific conditions. It doesn't tell you anything reliable about your overall trajectory, and treating it as though it does is a cognitive distortion, masquerading as humility, one that has ended more genuine change attempts than any external obstacle ever has. Progress that disappears usually hasn't actually disappeared. It's simply waiting in the contexts you haven't reached yet, doing nothing, neither helping nor hurting, until you extend the same patient attention there that already worked somewhere easier. The task at this stage isn't to recover something lost, it's to keep doing, deliberately and one room at a time, exactly what already worked once. In the next place, it hasn't been tried yet. And to resist the very human temptation to read a gap in coverage as evidence the whole project has failed. There's one more piece of this worth understanding, because it explains why the setback so often arrives right after a genuine win, rather than randomly scattered through the process. A successful stretch of holding your position tends to relax the vigilance that made that stretch possible in the first place, not because vigilance was ever meant to be permanent, but because success naturally lowers guard, the same way a person who's driven safely for a week might grow slightly less careful on day 8. This isn't a flaw unique to you. It's a nearly universal feature of how sustained effort works, the dip that follows a run of wins, and knowing it's coming in advance is often enough to soften its impact considerably. Expect the dip. Don't mistake it for the end of the story. It rarely is. And treating it as ordinary rather than catastrophic is itself one of the more advanced skills this stage is quietly asking you to build. Hold that expectation loosely enough to act on and firmly enough to remember, and the dip stops being a crisis. It becomes simply the next room waiting for the same patient attention you already know how to give. That, more than any single breakthrough, is what actually carries this work from a promising few weeks into something that finally, quietly, becomes the way you live. Not a straight line, a slow, uneven widening of ground you already know how to hold. That's the whole shape of it, start to end. Chapter 13. The Identity Mechanism. Somewhere around the second month, you notice something that has nothing to do with any single conversation. You simply expect yourself to answer honestly now, the way you once expected yourself to soften. The expectation is moved. This shift deserves its own careful attention, because it marks the exact point where a practice starts becoming an identity, and the difference between the two is not cosmetic. A practice is something you do, deliberately, often against resistance, requiring conscious effort each time you engage it. An identity is something you are, requiring no deliberation at all, because the behavior in question has stopped needing to be chosen and started simply happening, the way you don't deliberate about which hand you write with. You didn't arrive at this shift by deciding to become a more honest person in the abstract. You arrived at it by accumulating enough specific instances of the pause, the resistance held through, the honest answer delivered, that your mind quietly updated its model of who you are, based on what you'd actually demonstrated rather than what you'd merely intended. This is worth understanding precisely, because it explains why identity change, contrary to popular belief, cannot be achieved primarily through declaration. Telling yourself, "I am someone who speaks honestly," changes very little on its own, because your mind is a remarkably poor audience for claims unsupported by evidence, especially claims about yourself. What actually updates the model is behavior, repeated enough times under varied enough conditions, that the evidence becomes difficult to ignore. Every single instance across these 13 chapters, the pause held in a low-stakes room, the honest answer delivered at 9 at night despite exhaustion, the position maintained through a friend's visible discomfort, functioned as a small deposit of evidence. Identity change is not a leap. It's an accumulation, and you are currently standing on top of an accumulation large enough that something has finally, quietly tipped. Here's a distinction worth drawing carefully, because confusing the two keeps people performing a version of change that never actually settles into them. There's a difference between behaving differently and becoming different. Behaving differently can be sustained through willpower alone, for a while in a manner that always feels slightly effortful, slightly like acting. Becoming different removes the effort from the equation almost entirely, because the new behavior has stopped requiring active selection from among competing options, and started simply being the option that occurs to you first. You'll know you've crossed from the first state into the second not by any dramatic marker, but by a much quieter one. The old pattern, when it does occasionally reappear, will start to feel foreign rather than natural, a deviation from your default rather than a return to it. Consider what this reversal actually feels like from the inside, because it's one of the more disorienting and quietly satisfying experiences available in this entire process. For years, the honest answer was the effortful one, requiring the pause, the resistance, the deliberate override of an easier alternative. At some point, without any single dramatic transition, the calibrated, softened answer starts requiring more effort instead, feeling slightly false in your mouth, slightly like a costume you'd have to consciously put on rather than a garment you're already wearing. This reversal is the clearest available evidence that identity, not just behavior, has actually shifted, because effort has migrated to exactly the place you'd want it to migrate, making the old pattern the thing that now requires active maintenance rather than the new one. There's an important caution worth including here, because identity change of this kind can tip into its own distortion if left unexamined. Becoming someone who speaks their original instinct is not the same as becoming someone who speaks it without regard for how it lands, or who mistakes bluntness for honesty and inflicts unnecessary harm in the name of authenticity. The goal was never to eliminate tact. It was to stop using tact as a euphemism for erasure. A person who has genuinely integrated this work still considers timing, still considers the feelings of the person across from them, still chooses words with care. What's changed is that the underlying position being communicated is actually theirs, rather than a substitute manufactured to avoid discomfort. Confusing this integration with simple bluntness is a real risk at this stage, and worth watching for honestly, because overcorrection is its own kind of imbalance, just as costly as the original pattern in a different direction. Notice, too, how this identity shift changes your relationship to future difficulty, not by removing it, but by changing what it means when it arrives. A hard conversation used to feel like a test of whether you could override your nature. Now increasingly it feels like an occasion to exercise a capacity you already trust yourself to have, closer to how an experienced swimmer regards rough water, not as a question of whether they can swim, but simply as a different set of conditions to swim through. This shift from wondering whether you're capable to simply exercising a capability you already know you possess is perhaps the clearest marker available that the work described across this book has moved from something you're doing to something you've become. None of this means the work is finished, and it would be a disservice to suggest otherwise. Identity, once shifted, still requires occasional tending, the way any living structure requires maintenance regardless of how solidly it was built. But the nature of the tending changes considerably once identity has caught up to practice. You are no longer building the structure from nothing, fighting gravity with every board and nail. You are simply maintaining something that now, mostly, holds its own weight, occasionally needing your attention, but never again starting from the ground you started from 13 chapters ago. There's one final piece worth naming before this chapter closes, because it addresses a quiet fear that tends to surface right around this stage. Some worry that becoming this new, more honest version of themselves means the earlier version, the accommodating one, the one who spent years managing everyone else's comfort, was simply wrong, a mistake to be discarded without acknowledgement. That framing does the earlier version a disservice it doesn't deserve. That version kept you connected, kept you loved in the ways available at the time, carried you through years that needed carrying. You are not discarding that person. You are retiring a strategy that served its purpose, and has now finally been replaced by one that costs you less and represents you more accurately. Gratitude toward who you were is entirely compatible with relief at no longer needing to be only that. Carry that gratitude forward deliberately, because it changes the tone of everything that follows. A person who resents their old accommodating self tends to overcorrect into harshness, treating every remaining trace of softness as a failure, still needing to be stamped out. A person who holds gratitude alongside relief tends to integrate more gently, keeping the genuine kindness that was always part of that old pattern, while finally shedding the fear that made kindness feel mandatory rather than chosen. That's the version of this identity shift worth aiming for. Not a harder person, but a fuller one, still capable of warmth, now simply no longer required to purchase belonging with pieces of yourself you can't afford to keep losing. Chapter 14. Consolidation. Look back now at the distance between where this began and where you're standing, and notice that none of the individual pieces, on their own, would have gotten you here. It was never one insight. It was the way they locked together. This chapter exists to do something the previous 13 deliberately avoided: to step back from the individual mechanisms, the pause, the resistance, the relational recalibration, the identity shift, and see them as a single working system, rather than a sequence of separate lessons. Most people who encounter ideas like these absorb them one at a time, nod at each in isolation, and then wonder later why the ideas didn't compound into anything durable. The compounding only happens when the pieces are understood as interdependent, each one supporting the others, none of them sufficient alone. Start with the foundation, because everything else depends on it holding. The detection and substitution mechanism, described early in this narrative, is not something you defeated once and can now forget. It's still running quietly, in the background of nearly every interaction you have, exactly as it was designed to. What changed isn't its presence. What changed is your relationship to its output, because you built piece by piece a witness capable of noticing the substitution as it happens, rather than being run by it invisibly. That witness, the pause described in the 7th chapter, is the hinge the entire system turns on. Without it, none of the later work, the resistance tolerance, the relational recalibration, the identity shift, would have had anywhere to attach. From that hinge, 2 supports were built, and they needed each other more than either needed to stand alone. The resistance tolerance, learned by holding your honest position through the alarm your nervous system raised in protest, gave you the capacity to act on what the pause revealed. The energy infrastructure, the bridge sentences built for depleted moments, gave that capacity somewhere to survive on the days when your best self had already gone to bed. Neither piece alone would have carried you through an ordinary difficult week. The pause without the resistance tolerance would have left you simply noticing your own erasure without ever interrupting it. The resistance tolerance without the energy infrastructure would have collapsed reliably every time exhaustion arrived, which, as established, is precisely when the pattern tests you hardest. Consider how the relational and historical dimensions extend this structure outward and backward simultaneously. The relational chapter took the internal work and tested it against the actual people in your life, revealing which relationships could hold a truer version of you and which had been quietly built on the absence of one. The chapter on the oldest root took the same internal work and extended it backward in time, revealing that the mechanism being renegotiated wasn't a personal flaw invented recently, but an old, once necessary survival strategy that had simply outlived the conditions that built it. Both extensions matter because a system that only operates in the present, disconnected from its origin and disconnected from the people who will actually respond to its output, remains fragile, vulnerable to any sufficiently confusing new input. Understanding where the pattern came from and how it plays out with the actual people in your life turned an internal practice into something anchored in the full dimensionality of an actual life. Here's a distinction worth holding as you look at the whole system together. There's a difference between a collection of techniques and an integrated practice. A collection of techniques can be deployed individually, situationally, forgotten under pressure precisely when needed most. An integrated practice functions more like a single reflex with many components, activating together because they've been rehearsed together, each piece reinforcing the others until the boundaries between them blur. You are no longer, at this stage, consciously running through a checklist. Notice the detection, tolerate the resistance, deploy the bridge sentence if depleted. Consider the relational context. Remember the historical root. Those steps have started collapsing into something closer to a single motion. The way a driver no longer consciously sequences mirror, signal, turn, but simply merges. The components too well integrated to require separate attention. There's real value in occasionally slowing that integrated motion back down into its parts, especially during a setback. Because setbacks often reveal exactly which component has weakened and needs deliberate reinforcement. A recurrence under exhaustion points you back toward the energy infrastructure specifically, not the whole system. A recurrence with a particular person points you back toward the relational chapter, asking whether that specific relationship still carries old expectations that haven't yet been renegotiated. Learning to diagnose a setback by identifying which component failed, rather than treating every setback as evidence the whole system has failed, is itself an advanced skill this consolidation makes possible, one that wasn't available to you back when the pieces were still separate and unexamined. What you're holding now, if the work across these 14 chapters has actually taken, is not a set of tips you remember when convenient. It's closer to a new operating structure, built slowly, tested under real conditions, adjusted where it initially failed, and now, finally, coherent enough to function without your constant conscious supervision. That coherence didn't arrive through any single chapter. It arrived through all of them together, each one insufficient alone, each one indispensable in combination. Exactly the way a body isn't any single organ, but the coordination between all of them, quietly, continuously, mostly out of view, keeping something alive that no individual part could have sustained by itself. There's one more thing worth saying before this chapter closes, because consolidation can easily be mistaken for completion. And the two are not the same. A consolidated system is stable. It is not finished, because no system built around a human life ever truly finishes. Not while new rooms keep appearing, new relationships keep forming, new depleted evenings keep arriving on schedule regardless of how well the previous ones were handled. What consolidation actually offers isn't an endpoint. It's a reliable base, sturdy enough now that the next challenge doesn't require rebuilding from nothing, only extending something that already holds its own weight into whatever unfamiliar territory comes next. That's not a small achievement, even though it doesn't announce itself with the drama of a single breakthrough. It's the quiet difference between a life spent perpetually starting over and a life spent, finally, building forward. Hold that image as you move toward what remains. One chapter is left, and it isn't a summary of everything already said. It's the resolution of a question this narrative planted before you knew any of these mechanisms had names, before the pause had a shape, before the resistance had a reason. That question has been waiting patiently underneath every chapter you've read since. It's finally time to let it answer itself. Turn toward it now, with everything this chapter just gathered still steady beneath you. This is the last threshold, and you are already standing at it. Nothing more needs building before it. What remains only needs to be let in. Everything up to now has been preparation for a single, quiet arrival still ahead. Chapter 15. The New Way of Seeing Remains. Go back for a moment to the woman at the table, the one who read the message 3 times and answered none of them, the coffee going cold while she opened her phone and closed it, and opened it again. That scene wasn't background. It was the question this entire narrative was built to answer. And the answer arrives now, not as suspense resolved, but as something closer to recognition. The question underneath that scene was never really about the message, or the coffee, or the phone. It was the question posed at the end of the opening. the one about what you do with your time versus what you do with what's left of you after the time runs out. Here is what 15 chapters have been building toward saying plainly. Those were never two separate questions. The exhaustion you feel at the end of days spent managing everyone else's comfort. The depletion that shows up disguised as simple tiredness is not a byproduct of how you spent your hours. It's the direct cost of spending those hours as someone other than yourself. A toll charged not for the tasks completed, but for the constant invisible labor of translation between what you actually thought and what you allowed yourself to say. This is the truth. The entire structure of this narrative was arranged to help you arrive at honestly, rather than simply be told. Time was never really the scarce resource in your life. Self was the scarce resource, spent faster than time itself by every unnecessary substitution, every calibrated answer standing in for an honest one, every accommodation that cost you a small, unregistered piece of the person making it. You can manage time perfectly, optimize every calendar block, eliminate every wasted hour, and still end each day emptier than when it began. Because the emptiness was never a scheduling problem. It was a self-problem, and no amount of better time management touches it. Consider what this reframing does to a life once it's actually absorbed, rather than merely understood intellectually. The old question, how do I find more time, sends you searching in the wrong direction entirely, toward earlier alarms, tighter schedules, fewer obligations, all of it circling a resource that was never really the one running out. The new question, the one this narrative has spent 15 chapters teaching you to actually ask, is how much of yourself survives an ordinary day intact? And that question sends you somewhere entirely different. Toward the pause, the resistance held, the honest answer given even when the softer one would have been easier. This is the shift Emerson was pointing toward across an entire essay, concerned, at its core, with exactly this distinction, though he had different words for it. Words about the sacredness of your own unedited perception, about the world's constant, quiet pressure to keep you in its own borrowed opinion, about the courage required to trust the flicker of instinct that arrives before the group has weighed in. There's a distinction worth holding as this book closes, because it's the distinction the entire 15 chapters were built to teach through accumulation rather than declaration. There's a difference between a life that looks full and a life that is full. A life that looks full can be built entirely from borrowed positions, calibrated responses, hours spent in rooms performing a version of yourself sturdy enough to survive scrutiny. A life that is full requires something harder to fake and far more durable once achieved. A self that shows up consistently enough, across enough ordinary days, that its presence stops being an event and starts being simply how you live. You have spent this narrative building the second kind, slowly, imperfectly. Through the pause and the resistance, and the relational recalibration and the patient extension into harder and harder rooms. And what you're left with now is not a technique you'll eventually forget. It's a person you've become, tested under real conditions, still standing. Think back to the flicker in the opening scene, the woman reading the same message 3 times, unable to answer, the cold coffee sitting untouched between her and a decision she couldn't yet make. That scene never told you what she decided. It couldn't, because the scene was never really about her. It was about the exact moment, familiar to everyone who has ever felt the pull between the honest answer and the safer one, when the whole architecture this book describes gets tested in miniature, cup by cup, message by message, day by ordinary day. You've spent 15 chapters learning what she needed to know in that moment. And the knowing itself is the resolution this narrative promised from its very first paragraph. Not a guarantee that every difficult moment resolves easily. A guarantee that you now know, in your body as much as your mind, what it actually costs to keep choosing the substitute, and what becomes available the moment you stop. What remains as this journey closes is not a finish line. It's a permanent shift in which question organizes your days, moving forward from this point on. Not, how do I fit everything in, but how much of myself will still be here at the end of this? That second question, asked honestly and returned to daily, is what Emerson meant in his own language by trusting yourself. And it's what this entire narrative has spent 15 chapters trying to make not just an idea you agree with, but a practice your body already knows how to run, without waiting for permission. The new way of seeing does not announce itself with fanfare. It shows up quietly. The next time someone asks your opinion and you notice, almost without effort now, that the answer arriving is actually yours. It shows up in the extra second you no longer need to manufacture, because the pause has become simply how you listen to yourself before you speak. It shows up on the exhausted evening when the old easier agreement is right there, requiring nothing, and you reach instead for the bridge sentence, buying yourself the small mercy of an honest answer given later rather than a false one given now. None of this looks like transformation from the outside. From the inside, it is the entire difference between a life spent managing everyone else's comfort and a life spent, finally, occupied by the person who was always supposed to be living it. The coffee was never really the point. Neither was the message. The point was always the person sitting at that table deciding, in that ordinary, unremarkable moment, whether to keep disappearing a little at a time or to finally, quietly, sit back down as herself. You know now what that decision actually requires. You've spent this whole journey building the capacity to make it. What happens next isn't written anywhere else, but in the next ordinary room you walk into, carrying, for the first time in longer than you can measure, all of yourself with you. There is nothing left to plant here, no further open loop, no question deferred to some later chapter that no longer exists. What's left is only this, plain enough to carry without effort. The self you kept spending was never gone, only lent out too freely, and every day from here forward is simply an opportunity to spend it, finally, on the life that was always yours to live.